Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are going to dive into a 2,000-year-old legal text that, believe it or not, asks a question you might find on a tech blog today. It's a really fascinating look at how ancient minds reasoned through problems that are suddenly incredibly relevant to our modern world of automation and AI. All right, so let's just jump right in with the big question that frames our whole discussion. Can a machine, all by itself, perform a sacred ritual? Now, that sounds like a debate we should be having about artificial intelligence in the 21st century, right? Well, the conversation we're about to unpack is thousands of years old. And our source for this whole thing is the Talmud. We're talking about a central text of rabbinic Judaism, where, tucked away in its pages, ancient sages were debating a surprisingly high-tech piece of equipment, an automated machine for the kosher slaughter of an animal. Yep, you heard that right, automation 2,000 years ago. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the initial problem they were facing. Then we'll see how they uncovered a huge contradiction in their own texts. We're going to follow their train of thought as they go from a pretty simple solution to something way more sophisticated. We'll even see how they apply this logic to a case of murder, and then finally, we'll connect all of it back to our world today. Okay, first up, the kosher machine problem. Let's get right into the specific technological puzzle that kicked off this entire debate that would last for centuries. The core question they were asking was this: if you attach a knife to a wheel to perform a kosher slaughter, does it count? You see, for the act to be considered kosher, a person has to be directly involved with specific intent. So the big question is, does using a machine like this break that essential link between the person and the sacred act? And this, right here, is where the plot really thickens. Because when the rabbis started looking into this, they found two completely different answers in their sources. It created this intellectual puzzle that they just had to solve. The problem couldn't be clearer. You have one source that says the slaughter is valid, and you have another that says it is absolutely not valid. A total contradiction. So what gives? How could both possibly be true? The sages knew there had to be some kind of underlying principle that could make sense of both rulings. So their first crack at solving this puzzle was based on a really simple and, intuitive idea. Where's the machine getting its power from? The first solution they came up with was this. The ruling that says it's valid, that must be talking about a potter's wheel, something powered directly by a person's foot on a pedal. It's basically just an extension of their own body. And the one that says it's not valid, that must mean a water wheel, powered by the flow of a river. Nature is doing the work, not the person. Makes sense, right? A simple, elegant solution. But it wasn't going to be that easy. Oh no. Because this is the Talmud we're talking about, and they never, ever stop at the easy answer. Someone inevitably asks, yeah, but what if? What if both rulings were actually talking about the exact same machine, a water wheel? How on earth could it be both valid and not valid then? And that question, that's what forces a much deeper and way more powerful analysis. And this brings us right to the heart of the whole thing. The sages have to move beyond just the source of the power and start thinking about the nature of the force itself. And in doing so, they develop this absolutely critical distinction between what they call primary force and secondary force. First up, you have primary force, or causation. This is the direct, immediate result of something you do. The easiest way to think about it is like pushing over the very first domino in a long line. That initial push, the one you actually made, that's primary force. You are considered fully responsible for it. And then you have secondary force, or causation. This is everything that happens after that first domino falls. It's the 10th domino, the 100th domino, the ripples spreading out in a pond after you drop a stone. It's a consequence of what you did for sure, but it's a step removed. It's an action that's now continuing on its own. So let's take this idea and plug it back into our water wheel problem. A person opens a gate and releases water onto the wheel. If the animal is slaughtered by the very first turn of that wheel, the immediate result of the water you just released, that's primary force. The slaughter is valid. But if the animal is slaughtered on the second turn or the third or the 10th, well, now that's secondary force. The wheel is turning on its own momentum and the slaughter is not valid. You see what happened here? This was a brilliant shift in thinking. The rabbis realized it wasn't about the power source at all. The real issue, the thing that actually matters, is the chain of causation. It's about how directly a person's action is linked in that very moment to the final outcome. Now, you might be thinking, this is just a neat intellectual puzzle. But to prove how serious this principle really was, the text brings in a chillingly real-world example, a case of murder. This shows that the distinction they're making has serious, real-life, ethical, and legal stakes. So one of the sages, Rapapa, lays out this scenario. Someone ties another person up and then diverts a channel of water onto them, causing them to drown. He rules that the person who diverted the water is liable for murder. And his reasoning? He says the water acts like his arrows. It's a direct weapon that he fired.
But then he adds the critical distinction. This ruling only works if the victim was close by and killed by that initial rush of water, the primary force. The action is direct, it's immediate, just like the first turn of that water wheel. But, and this is key, if the victim was farther away and the water had to flow on its own for a bit before it reached him, that's considered secondary force. The text calls it an indirect action, and the legal liability completely changes. In that case, the person is actually exempt from the charge of murder. The principle holds even when the stakes are life and death. And just to show how incredibly thorough these guys were, they even briefly debate a proof from the biblical story of Abraham taking up the knife to sacrifice Isaac. They wonder, does this prove a knife has to be held in the hand? But they quickly dismiss it, concluding that the story is just teaching us about Abraham's devotion, not laying down a universal legal rule about tools. They had to check every possible angle. Okay, so let's bring this all together. Why in the world should we care about a 2,000-year-old debate about kosher law and water wheels? Well, because the underlying logic they developed is shockingly relevant today. What this ancient text really gives us is this incredibly sophisticated framework for thinking about responsibility and automation. It creates a clear line between direct human agency, that's our primary force, and the indirect consequences that ripple out from our actions, the secondary force. It forces us to ask, at what exact point does a tool stop being just an extension of a person and start acting on its own?
And here's the truly amazing part. The fundamental questions that these sages were wrestling with about a simple water wheel are the exact same questions that software engineers, ethicists, and lawyers are asking today about complex algorithms, military drones, and artificial intelligence.
Which brings us to our final thought, a question for you to ponder. A self-driving car has to make a split-second, fatal decision in a no-win scenario. Who is responsible? Is it the owner who turned the car on? The programmer who wrote the code years ago? The manufacturer? Is it a case of primary force or is it secondary force? These ancient thinkers, well, they've given us a powerful language to even begin to unravel that very modern puzzle.